Hello, everyone. My name is Sheila Shao, and I'm your host for today's webinar titled Standing Against Racism and War, the Only Road to Peace. We're going to wait a minute or so while folks join in on this live stream, but for those who are already on with us, please take this time to share this live stream so that our message today will reach a wider audience. Thank you again for joining us today for this webinar titled Standing Against Racism and War, the Only Road to Peace. My name is Sheila Shao, and I am a research analyst with the California Community Colleges, activist and organizer with Pivot to Peace. If you haven't already, once again, please share this live stream so that we can reach a wider audience. Pivot to Peace is a coalition of people from all walks of life. Public sector workers, lawyers, students, veterans, academics, healthcare workers, and so forth, who came together concerned about the reorientation of US military and foreign policy that identifies China as the competitor and adversary. We are a group that is committed to mobilizing public opinion under the banner of rejecting escalation towards global conflict and instead urge peace and cooperation with China. The anti-China demonization campaign has fomented a rampant increase in anti-Asian hate crimes, which has been fostered by the racist scapegoating rhetoric that we've seen by the Trump administration. According to Stop Hate AAPI, these are the most updated numbers, which has reported 2,600 incidents of anti-Asian hate crimes since March. Racism is a tried and tested tool that has been wielded by the US government to drive popular support for war. We saw this in the early 2000s during the US war on terror and the onslaught of Islamophobia. We've seen this during World War II when Japanese Americans were forced into heinous camps. There are countless examples of racist rhetoric to wage war on countries abroad and here at home. This week, the House passed a resolution to condemn COVID-19 related anti-Asian racism. While this is a small step, it really only narrowly addresses the issue of racism. We in Pivot to Peace are committed to mobilizing the people and public opinion against impending war and racism, because at the end of the day, neither of these things serve the American people and the people around the world. So this will be the main topic of our webinar today. And of course, unsurprisingly, there have been major escalations by the US government inching closer to confrontation with China, and our speakers will touch on those recent events as well. But before we begin the program, I want to take some time to pay our respects to peace activist and lawyer, Kevin Zees. Kevin was one of the initial signers of Pivot to Peace, our mission statement, and he dedicated his life to the struggle against US imperialism and injustice. He and his partner, Margaret Flowers, founded the progressive outlet Popular Resistance. There is a deep void left in the progressive movement and unity without Kevin, and we in Pivot to Peace hope that we can uphold that legacy that he left behind. We send all of our love and thoughts to his family and loved ones during this time. So now we will begin our program today. First, I would like to introduce Julie Tang. Julie is a retired judge of the San Francisco Superior Court and previously an assistant district attorney in San Francisco. She helped co-founded the Comfort Women Justice Coalition and the Rape of Nanjing Redress Coalition. She is one of the co-founders of Pivot to Peace. Judge Tang will be talking about the effects of US Cold War on the Chinese and Asian American community. Welcome, Julie.
I want to thank everyone for watching this webinar. I'm honored to be working with a group of peace activists in America to start a peace movement and urge the United States government to pivot to peace rather than war with China. The level of racism experienced by Asian Americans as a result of the US Cold War with China is unprecedented. We have a US president who made scapegoating out of ethnic groups central to his political agenda. First, it was the Muslims, then the Mexicans and Latin immigrants, and now the Chinese. He radicalizes his constituents to hate China and incites them to believe China is entirely responsible for its failings to protect Americans from the pandemic. He had kind words to say about the KKK, white nationalists, but throw racial slurs at the Chinese people, calling the pandemic China virus. As a result of Mr. Trump's propaganda against China, that China is somehow negligent in containing the pandemic and causing unprecedented infections and deaths in the US, lawsuits have been filed in 6 states: California, Florida, Nevada, Missouri, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and Texas. People in these states responded to Mr. Trump's call for war with China. They seek damages in the trillions, equivalent to what we owe to China. As you know, China purchased billions of treasury bonds to bail us out of the 2008 financial crisis. And they sent us all the inexpensive goods in exchange for a piece of paper called treasury bonds. And for all of that China has done for the US, our lawmakers are proposing a bill that would remove the exemption clause from the Foreign Sovereignties Immunities Act, which immunizes a sovereign country from lawsuits filed by US citizens. This is a reciprocal law that protects countries from being sued by each other's citizens. A bill to exclude only China from such a protection has already left the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, paving its way to be passed by both the Senate and Congress at the next session, and raising the vain hope for the litigants that they could collect as damages all of China's hard-earned savings that it thought was secure and safe with the United States. Our US Senator from California, Dianne Feinstein, was one of the few who voted no on this bill at the committee. She's one of the few senators who understands China better than any of the others, because it was Senator Feinstein, who was the mayor of San Francisco in the 80s, who established a sister city relations with Shanghai. I accompanied her to Shanghai in 1982 and saw her sincere admiration for the Chinese people. She said China was a respectable country and removal of a sovereign immunity should not be used against China, and I would add, not to be used for frivolous lawsuits or malicious prosecutions either. Senator Feinstein's statement was a breath of fresh air, one of the very few positive and honest statements given by politicians these days about China. China hate is now the norm, and anything else is subversive. As long as both political parties and the American mainstream media, such as the New York Times, NPR, Washington Post, are in locksteps with each other about China and keep republishing negative information, quoting non-corroborative, even anonymous sources, and spreading misinformation about China, the anti-China sentiments will not end, and it will take us to a real war with China when missiles are deployed. I shudder to think of such a scenario. As former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said, the result of a war between the US and China would be calamitous for both countries. In my 50 years living in the United States, I have never felt more fearful for my personal safety than now. And I know most of my Asian American friends feel the same. That we are more worried about racism than pandemic, because with the pandemic, we have a fighting chance to keep ourselves safe. But when racism rears its ugly head, we don't know if we could protect ourselves or our family against it. Racism is real, and every time Mr. Trump uses the slur word China virus or Kung flu, he's creating another hundreds or even thousands of China and Chinese haters out there. Since March 2020, over 2,600 hate crimes have been self-reported to the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council and Chinese for Affirmative Action Stop AAPI hate website by Asian Americans. When schools open up, I hope all the schools in the US would have a plan to protect all the children in our schools, especially the Asian kids who are most vulnerable to bullying from racism and the pandemic. According to the polls, Asians are more likely to vote for Biden in this November election than for Trump. But honestly, as a lifelong Democrat, I don't feel I'm very safe in the hands of the Democrats either. The Democrats in the Senate just announced on September 17th a massive spending bill aimed to stepping up US hostility toward China to the tune of $350 billion. The greatest share of the money will go to science and technology development, which will compete with China's advanced technology. I have no problems with that. In fact, that is how we should deal with China's more advanced technological developments. But political pundits opined, and I tend to agree, that those money will probably all go to the already very rich, biggest tech firms. Just like the majority of the pandemic stimulus money that should have gone to small businesses actually went to big corporations. And the unemployed workers and the 20% of our population, which is impoverished, will not see any of that money to make their lives better. Our huge income gap will remain unchanged. And what frightens me even more is the money earmarked to promote separatism in Hong Kong and Xinjiang under the high order of democracy and human rights, and the appropriation of $125 million of military spending to induce small countries, our so-called junior partners, probably not so rich countries in Asia, to join in on attacking China and fighting a proxy war for us. The idea that billions of dollars are appropriated to promote separatism for Hong Kong would be unthinkable under any other times. But we now have an open season to attack and confront China in any way we see fit, as long as we think we can win. But Hong Kong is protected by the national security law which it just passed, which criminalizes acts of secession, sedition, and terrorism. China was prescient to make sure a law is in place to discourage and prevent separatism. Besides, how democratic is the US to encourage separatism in Hong Kong when a recent polling shows only 17% of its people support such a concept? Is that the kind of democracy that we're teaching Hong Kong to be? To force a system upon them that the overwhelming majority do not want? In the last 40 years, China lifted 800 million people from poverty, and it is on its way to alleviate poverty for another 600 million people. Why do we want to take down a country that has helped so many people? The Chinese Communist Party has a clear purpose and agenda to provide all its citizens a safe, secure, and prosperous country to live in. China's economy is fast growing, and its history of non-aggression shows China is not likely to go to war unless provoked. We have no business to provoke China using Hong Kong or Xinjiang as a battleground. We must leave China to equitably resolve its own domestic issues by its own means. There is a better way to handle a strong China. Send people who know China and respect China, like Senator Feinstein, to negotiate with them, and not to Mr. Pompeo. China regards loyalty as one of the highest values and will respond positively when goodwill is shown. In the Book of War, Sun Tzu said, to win a war, know thy enemy first, then know thyself. China is getting to know us through the many Cold War tactics that we have deployed. Most of them are failures. As China has been able to counter those tactics blow for blow, yet never showing its hands, we are fighting this war based on the failed notion that we can win by lies and propaganda and brutal gangster tactics, like kidnapping Huawei CEO on the flimsiest of evidence for some trumped-up criminal charges, like robbing a hard-earned, successful business like TikTok, and kicking out all the smartest and brightest math, engineers, science, and technology scholars and students from China who would have contributed to this country's technological development while they study here, and some may stay here after they finish their studies, and persecuting our Chinese American scientists who contribute towards researches in cancer, gene therapies, and other diseases. Why do we ban and persecute them? Because they are Chinese and are all suspected of being spies. Insofar as the Cold War is concerned, it is one blunder after another on our part. Finally, I wanted to say, can we save America from going down this war path with China and create peace altogether? I worry for our children growing up in this country. What kind of an America will they be living in? I believe they can live in a better one if we as a country resolve to stay peaceful and get the best bargain out of a productive and well-meaning relationship with China. And the time to do it is now, not 5 years later, when we have exhausted all our resources and found that we have accomplished nothing. Thank you again for attending this seminar. And if you feel you can support our vision for peace, would you go to our website and sign on as our endorser and to our organization? Or better yet, support us with a donation to advance our work. Back to you, Sheila.
Thank you so much, Julie, for kicking off our program and the call to action. Next, I would like to introduce Carlos Martinez. Carlos is an activist and author who runs a politics/history blog, Invent the Future, and is a convener of the No Cold War campaign. His first book, The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse, was published by Left World in 2019. Today, he will be diving into what the new Cold War is and the global campaign he is helping to spearhead. He joins us all the way from London. Thank you for joining us, Carlos.
Right, thank you very much, Sheila. I would like to start off by just adding my voice to those paying tribute to Kevin Zees, who was a brilliant activist and a popular educator, and he leaves a valuable legacy that I think will continue to be very widely treasured throughout the world. So my name is Carlos Martinez. I'm convener of an international campaign called No Cold War, which was set up earlier this year in response to the very dangerous deterioration in US-China relations. So far in 2020, we've seen the trade war escalating and heard ever louder calls for so-called decoupling from some senior figures in the United States. The Trump regime has persistently tried to blame China for the US's shameful and frankly horrifying mismanagement of the pandemic. Mike Pompeo is touring the world, trying to persuade US allies to shut Huawei out of their network infrastructure. The propaganda around Hong Kong and Xinjiang has reached, frankly, hysterical levels. And currently we have the attack on TikTok and WeChat and a rising hostility towards Chinese investment, Chinese technology, and indeed Chinese people. And that's combined with an ongoing effort to encircle China militarily with ever more frequent US naval operations in the South China Sea, increased weapon sales to Taiwan, encouraging Japan's rearmament, which is very explicitly aimed at containing China, deployment of the THAAD anti-ballistic missile defense system in South Korea and Guam, the establishment of a marine base in the north of Australia, and so on. So all of this increasingly looks like a new Cold War. And I think it's useful to just delve briefly into what a Cold War is. So the original Cold War, in which the US and the Soviet Union were the main protagonists, had different meanings for the different participants. Actually, the Soviets didn't use the expression Cold War. They didn't see it as a battle between superpowers. They considered that they were defending their right and the right of other countries to pursue a model of development other than the one prescribed by the US. That is, a model that wasn't directly aimed at producing economic and political benefit for US-led Western capitalism. And that's why the Soviet Union's allies during that period included, for example, the people of Vietnam fighting against imperialist domination, the people of Korea fighting against imperialist domination, the people of South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Guinea-Bissau, Algeria, fighting against colonialism, fighting against apartheid, the people of Cuba, of Grenada, of Chile, fighting for their right to construct socialist societies. whereas the US and its allies fought a very different kind of Cold War. Indeed, you could say that the US was fighting for the opposite of what the Soviet Union was fighting for. If the Soviets and their allies were fighting for different countries' rights to develop on their own terms and according to their own plans, the US and its allies were fighting precisely to prevent that. And this was verbalized very clearly by President Truman in 1947, when he said that we can survive only if the whole world adopts the American system. So in Cold War thinking, there's no question of multipolarity, there's no question of one world, many systems, there's no concept of development and emergence outside of a system of imperialism. Now, the US and its allies ultimately won the Cold War in the sense that the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, nor do the other European socialist countries. And it's no accident that this period from the beginning of the 1990s coincided with the high tide of neoliberalism, the domination of the US-led financial institutions. This was the era of structural adjustment programs, of privatization, of deregulation, of economic globalization that was specifically on the US's terms. And although the end of the Cold War was supposed to bring peace and harmony, after all, it was called the end of history, it actually brought forth a period of intense military aggression in which the US and its allies launched major wars against Iraq, against Yugoslavia, against Afghanistan, against Libya. But particularly with the rise of China, that post-Cold War era, that high tide of US hegemony is coming to an end. China is at a stage where it has to be recognized as a global power in its own right. It's the world's largest trading nation. It's the second biggest economy. Furthermore, it's increasingly no longer just a cheap manufacturing base. It's emerging as a science and technology powerhouse in its own right. Meanwhile, at the diplomatic level, it's increasingly willing to speak out at the UN and other forums against hegemony, for example, using its veto multiple times in the UN Security Council against military action against Syria. And there are a few Chinese concepts that are causing real concern for those in the US that dedicate themselves to the so-called Project for a New American Century. One of these is the Belt and Road Initiative, with China working with 130 countries worldwide on infrastructure projects. Another is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Another is the Chinese government's Made in China 2025 roadmap, which outlines a path towards comprehensive industrial upgrade, towards China becoming one of the leaders of the global economy. And taken together, these constitute actually no threat whatsoever to ordinary people in the United States or elsewhere in the West, but they do constitute a huge threat to US domination. And that's why a large part of the US ruling class now is pushing a new Cold War agenda at this point in time. We should be absolutely 100% clear that a new Cold War is potentially disastrous for humanity. It will reduce global cooperation in an era where we desperately need more global cooperation to tackle global challenges. Climate change, pandemics, microbial resistance, ending wars, ending poverty. These are urgent and massive problems that can only be solved at a global level. So we need to continue working to build the broadest possible range of forces against Cold War and for peace and for cooperation. On behalf of the No Cold War campaign, I would like to thank Pivot to Peace for the excellent work that you've been doing, and I hope that we can continue to build together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for breaking down such a complex topic in just a few minutes. If folks haven't already, please do check out the No Cold War campaign at nocoldwar.org. They will be hosting an International Peace Forum next Saturday, September 26th. And in fact, a few of our speakers today will be speaking at this Peace Forum. Next, we will be hearing from Margaret Kimberly. Margaret is a co-founder and editor and senior columnist for Black Agenda Report. She is the author of the book, Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. She is also a contributor to the anthologies In Defense of Julian Assange and Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence. Ms. Kimberly is an administrative committee member of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the coordinating committee of Black Alliance for Peace. Thank you for joining us, Margaret.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Greetings, everyone. I thank you for joining me and all the other speakers today. I can't recall a time in my life when this country endangered the world on so many different fronts. The recent attacks by the US government on China are unprecedented, even for a nation with such a deeply retrograde history. The new COVID-19 virus became the rationale for rhetorical attacks by the president, the Congress, and the corporate media. It isn't just mega hat-wearing deplorables who have encouraged xenophobia, smears, and bigotry. The coalescing of the political duopoly into a unipolar imperial partnership with no pretense of opposition feeds into this process. The Republicans and Democrats try to outdo one another in competition to see who can denounce China more. Donald Trump and Joe Biden both vie with one another, alleging that the other is insufficiently bellicose towards China's government, now often referred to as the Chinese Communist Party, a term which has clearly scored well in focus groups. There is even proposed congressional legislation, the Name the Enemy Act, which would require federal documents to refer to Xi Jinping as the president of the People's Republic, preventing him from being referred to as the president of the People's Republic of China. He would have to be called the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. I think we're back in Freedom Fries territory. The end result is, of course, increased racism here in the US, something which isn't difficult to accomplish in a country whose very founding was a result of attempts at extermination and enslavement of millions of people. People of Asian heritage are never regarded as being fully American. Only people of European ancestry are considered as such and thought to be worthy of rights and respect. The Chinese Exclusion Act actually targeted Chinese people in an effort to prohibit their immigration for some 60 years, from 1882 to 1943. I recall an Asian colleague of mine telling me that even here in the enlightened and liberal New York City, she's often told that she speaks English very well. She's a fourth-generation American, but to many people, she still belongs in the other category. Obviously, we must call out racism when we see it, but we have another obligation, and that is to reject American imperialism, which is often the means of encouraging racist thoughts and action. It is opposition to aggression committed on a mass scale that will stop racism, whether that bigotry is expressed against people of Asian ancestry or anyone else. We are watching in real time a hybrid war, and not the first, committed by the Trump administration with the full support of the Democratic Party. That is often the root of hatred and resentments. It isn't enough to condemn racism. We cannot be mere do-gooders pleading for tolerance. In just the last 2 months, the US closed the Chinese consulate in Houston, snatched US control of TikTok from Tencent to an American business, pressured vassal state allies to undermine their own relationships with Huawei and continue a relentless propaganda campaign to give the appearance that China has 1 million people imprisoned in Xinjiang. Of course, the US has imprisoned more than 2 million people in its own mass incarceration system. That is documented and beyond doubt. But if no one speaks up for the more than 1 million Black people who are incarcerated here, we shouldn't be surprised that anti-China sentiment exists in a country where white supremacy is normalized. Foreign policy cannot be considered a frill. We cannot have defense spending eating up 60% of the discretionary budget and expect to have our human needs met. We cannot allow political parties to demonize other nations and then express shock when racists here are emboldened. This dynamic doesn't apply only to China, but to people all over the world whose governments are demonized in order for the two war parties to convince us to engage in acts of aggression. We must work for peace, vote for peace, and not be fooled by pleas to back one of the war parties over the other. We must fight imperialism, fight the 800 US bases all over the world, and fight for our human rights. If we are in solidarity and commit ourselves to peace, anti-Chinese racism and all racism may become a thing of the past. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Margaret, for that call for solidarity and peace. Next, I am honored to introduce Dale Minami. Besides being a top lawyer in the San Francisco Bay Area and in personal litigation, Dale is famously known for leading a legal team of pro bono attorneys in successfully reopening the Korematsu versus US, resulting in the erasure of Fred Korematsu's criminal conviction for defying the internment of Japanese Americans. Minami is a co-founder of the Asian Law Caucus, the Asian American Bar Association of the Greater Bay Area, the Asian Pacific Bar of California, and the Coalition of Asian Pacific Americans. Minami dedicates his life to equality and justice for all Americans. Please welcome Dale.
All right, thank you, Sheila, for that kind introduction. I'm honored to be a part of this panel. That's a very important and timely one, given the situation we're living in, the very tumultuous and difficult times. I'd like to start with December 7, 1941, when the imperial forces of Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, which began World War II for the United States against Japan. President Roosevelt called it a day of infamy, but for Japanese Americans, we called it years of infamy, because 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom American citizens, were taken from their homes, exiled from the West Coast states, put into feeded horse stalls and transported across the country to the most dismal places in the United States to live in indefinite confinement in hastily built barracks, which were really prisons, and served their time there. The crime was Japanese ancestry. The justification was military necessity, that we had to put these people away because their ethnic characteristics, their status as Japanese Americans, or their background predisposed them to disloyalty. And also, they had committed certain acts of espionage. That was the basis for the legal justification and political justification. And these folks, including my parents, lived out their lives for 3 to 4 years in these places for indefinite confinement with total disregard of their constitutional rights. They had no right to a trial. They had no right to an attorney. They had no notice of the charges. They were just swept up, taken away to unknown places for an unknown duration. This was not an aberration, because if you look at the history of Asian Americans in this country, starting from the first Chinese Americans who came here, the Asian Americans have suffered very similar fates of first being welcomed as cheap labor and then suffering incredible discrimination in both the laws and in just their existence, violent hate crimes, destruction of entire cities. So that what happened to Japanese Americans was just a continuation and maybe a culmination at that point of the rivers of racism that just overflow during times of crises. And so Japanese Americans became marginalized, became the scapegoats. They became the, quote, enemy that needed to satisfy both economic and political interests at the time. 3 men stood up and challenged the incarceration of Japanese Americans. All 3 men cases went to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled that the incarceration, well, essentially the exile and detention, were constitutional. And they claimed that they accepted the military argument that, and the government argument that, again, Japanese Americans' ethnic and cultural characteristics predisposed them to disloyalty. There's a larger dynamic going on. The image or the impression of the perpetual foreigners that is visited upon Asian Americans, that we are not truly American citizens because really we're not white. And this is obvious because these rules that led the Japanese Americans to incarceration did not apply to Germans or Italians, and we were at war with them as well. And so why is that? It's pretty obvious that the racism that propelled these decisions was really confined to people of color, which were Japanese Americans. They were just subjected to different standards than white Americans, Germans, and Italians. 40 years later, evidence was discovered by researchers that the justifications for the incarceration, for the exile of Japanese Americans were complete fabrications. They were complete lies, and the government told these lies to the Supreme Court to justify what had been done to this group of mostly American citizens. Eventually, this evidence was presented to 3 different courts in the Western states. In the case that I worked on, Korematsu versus the United States, we drew the first hearing. And in that first hearing, we presented the evidence, and the Judge Patel here in San Francisco overturned Fred Korematsu's conviction, declaring that what was done to Japanese Americans was unjustified, that it was based on racism, and that the government had committed serious misconduct in the United States Supreme Court. This was at a time in 1983 when Japanese Americans led a movement of people of all colors, a rainbow coalition, to petition Congress to get relief for what they felt were unconstitutional deprivations of their rights. They started a movement. The congressmen and the Senate introduced bills to give Japanese Americans $20,000 in an apology for what was done. Hearings were held around the country, and the conclusion was very telling. The conclusion of the commission was that this disgraceful civil rights disaster and the broad historical causes that shaped these decisions to incarcerate Japanese Americans were race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. We hear those echoes of history today. What has been happening currently on the streets and in this country in terms of the types of violence committed against Asian Americans is also an echo of what happened in 1982 when Vincent Chin was brutally murdered. The murderers thought he was Japanese, and it was at a time when the United States was in serious competition with Japan. And in fact, Japan was overcoming or was winning some of the economic battles, especially in the automotive industry. So Vincent Chin was murdered in Detroit by out-of-work auto workers who blamed Japan for their plight when it was really the United States' failure and complacency that led to their reduction of the economic success. We've seen other people victimized afterwards, and a number of Asian Americans who were either mistaken for another ethnicity. Some were Chinese were mistaken for Japanese. Japanese were mistaken for Vietnamese. Vietnamese were mistaken for other Asian groups. A number of Asian Americans were actually murdered or assaulted in the aftermath of Vincent Chin's murder. But we've seen it again recently. Think of Wen-Ho Lee and the racial profiling that is occurring against Chinese Americans, especially Chinese Americans today. But the spillover is that people in this country sometimes can't recognize the difference, or oftentimes cannot recognize the difference among the different ethnic groups. And so we are all victims. We are all potential victims. And if you see some of the video snippets of the kind of discrimination that's occurring, the yelling of going back to your own country, the actual physical assaults, we're hearing that echo of history today. of what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. The ultimate result is great fear of for me, just going outside. And I don't live in San Francisco, but so it's not that this is some unusual occurrence. It's tied directly, I feel, and fueled by racist comments about China. And it has to do with the ostensibly the Chinese, quote, flu, the Kung flu, racist statements that really agitate non-Asians to commit actions against us. But there's a deeper reason. I mean, obviously, one of the deeper reasons is racism, and those rivers have overflowed again to impact our Asian American community. But there's also another reason, and that's the economic competition with China, which is now fueling again those kind of statements, because China is doing things in the international scale, which economically are a very huge competition for the United States. And in the future, the United States is fearful. And so I think some of those reasons, not just the racism, but the economic competition, is causing non-Asian folks to react negatively. What we're afraid of is not just the everyday violence, but the kind of mass hysteria that led to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And while I think that we're going to find a lot more resistance than what happened to Japanese Americans, because nobody stood up and supported Japanese Americans, not one national group. And so we are alone. But when redress was passed, again, we had a political coalition of all colors that supported Japanese Americans. So for me, the lesson is to find those allies. And in order to find those allies, you have to be an ally. It means you have to support the legitimate aspirations of other marginalized groups. It means supporting Black Lives Matter, in my mind. It means supporting LGBTQ communities, because you can't expect to have allies unless you're an ally yourself. And it also means to organize among ourselves. We need to be strong. We need to be organized. We need to be resistant. We need to be aggressive about this. We cannot let another 1942 occur where an entire populace of ethnic Asian Americans were taken away without constitutional rights. So the simple lesson is we need to fight back. We need to work with allies. We need to educate this American public. And we need to understand ourselves why this is happening. It's not just because the flu originated in China, which was really spread more by Italy and Europe than anywhere else. We need to understand that this has happened historically before, and we really need to consider stopping repeating history. So the fallout of what Pivot to Peace is doing in a good way benefits us all, but not just because it's right, but because it's also helps both economies. It helps the world. It helps individuals. It'll slow down violence against Asian Americans, which I'm concerned about. And so I'm really supportive of their efforts to educate and activate people. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that extremely informative talk, Dale. Before we wrap up with you here, in light of the Korematsu case, can you talk a little bit about the possible scenarios that could play out for the Chinese American community in the event that war breaks out with China?
Some folks ask whether the Korematsu case, one of the cases that sanctioned the incarceration of Japanese Americans or the exile, was repudiated. And yes, it was in some ways, but it doesn't matter what the law is in my mind. You can say whatever you want, but it's really the politics that govern whether drastic actions such as the incarceration can occur again. If there's the political will to do it, it doesn't matter what the law says. The law could be overcome in so many ways. New laws could be enacted and people could disregard the laws. The Supreme Court can say, no, the Korematsu case is right. So my fear is that folks believe they're protected by laws, but they're not. It's really political action, political forces that will make the difference between whether there's going to be a drastic action, such as an incarceration of an entire group.
Thank you again, Dale, for your time. Before we move on to the next speaker, I do want to encourage folks to sign our mission statement on peacepivot.org/mission and consider donating to our cause on the Pivot to Peace website. Next, I would like to introduce Samina Rahman. Samina is an anti-war activist based in Los Angeles and is currently a graduate student. She became interested in the anti-war and anti-imperialist movement based on her experiences growing up in the Middle East and experiencing Islamophobia post 9/11. Today, she will be connecting the experiences between the post 9/11 period to the current period. Thank you for joining us today, Samina.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sheila. And I'm really honored to be a part of this webinar. So there's a Michael Parenti saying that goes something like this. The most effective propaganda relies on framing rather than falsehood. By bending the truth rather than breaking it, using emphasis and other auxiliary embellishments, communicators can create a desired impression without resorting to explicit advocacy and without departing too far from the appearance of objectivity. This theme really summarizes the essence of designing and generating public consent when it comes to demonizing countries that are in conflict with the United States. In the early 2000s, it was Iraq. In the early 2010s, it was Syria and Libya. And since 2016, it has been China. I'm sure everyone has heard about the SARS-CoV-2 being referred to as the Chinese virus by the Trump administration. To attribute something as unpredictable as an epidemic to one country is incredibly problematic. According to the CDC, a novel H1N1 virus was detected first in the United States, with an estimated death toll of 151,000 to 575,000 worldwide. Ironically, it wasn't called the American virus. Rather, it was called the swine flu. In April, the New York Times stated that a key GOP strategy is to blame China and that elevating China's culpability for spreading the coronavirus may be the best way to improve their election chances. And this strategy laid the foundation for the massive spike in anti-Chinese racism, not just in the US, but across the West. This seems strangely reminiscent of the anti-Muslim sentiment and the Islamophobia that swept America after 9/11. After the attacks, the Bush administration laid a shock and awe invasion of Iraq to fight the war on terror. According to the Watson Institute at Brown University, over 182,000 civilians have died from direct war-related violence. While this was on the battlefield, American Muslims face increased racial profiling, suspicion, verbal assault, massive surveillance from the NYPD, and not to mention the ever-present threat from the Department of Homeland Security. The ACLU states that NYPD's intelligence division singled out Muslim religious leaders, student associations, businesses, and individuals for pervasive surveillance that is discriminatory and not conducted against institutions or individuals of other faith. One of the first victims of this bigotry was Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh American gas station owner in Arizona. Since then, many Sikh Americans have been assaulted in the name of Islamophobia. And of course, the demonization of Arabs and Muslims permeated Hollywood with works like Homeland, Zero Dark Theory, and many films and shows that fetishize the hunt for extremists, all the while disregarding the social fallout and alienation faced by Muslims in America and worldwide. All of this established the public consent for America's ongoing war and presence in Iraq and Afghanistan for the hunt of either al-Qaeda or for bringing democracy. We first heard claims of Iraqi soldiers ripping babies out of incubators by Naira, then Saddam Hussein's WMDs, followed by Muammar Gaddafi's equipping his army with Viagra for mass assault on women, all later found to be baseless. These lies show that the US will spare no imagination to fabricate whatever is needed to manufacture consent for its geopolitical agenda. The US state-funded media is going full force with a massive and expensive campaign against China's use of vocational training centers as a de-radicalization effort in Xinjiang. We hear claims in the same vein as Iraq and Libya. Chinese Han soldiers assaulting Uyghur women, mass wave of sterilizations, forced labor, even genocide against the Uyghur population and their religion, Islam. This includes allegations of people not being allowed to wear the headscarf, have beards, or pray in mosques. But all of this can be disproved with videos of the daily life of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. There are 39,000 mosques in China, 25,000 of which are in Xinjiang. And the call to prayer, the adhan, is called publicly in China, a luxury not afforded to Muslims in the United States. A fact ignored in this discourse is that Hui Muslims are the largest group of Muslims in China, with a population of approximately 18 million people, not the Uyghurs, and they face no such claims of persecution. Given all of this, surely the US and all its media associates cannot be trusted when it talks about the affairs of a sovereign country it considers as competition for global superpower. The US warmongers have lied before, and they're lying now, again. So what does this all mean? It means that as American Muslims, we have more in common with Chinese Americans and Chinese people, both Muslims and non-Muslims, and not the warmongers who shed crocodile tears for us. We as American Muslims should refuse to be pawns in a propaganda game that can lead to disasters like we saw in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. We must refuse to endanger the lives of 1.4 billion people, among which tens of millions are Muslims. This is why we need a pivot to peace with China, not a pivot to war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samina, for that extremely important talk. We wanted to apologize for the audio issues that we were experiencing earlier. We definitely will work on getting this resolved soon, and we'll repost the full webinar with all those issues resolved. So thank you so much for bearing with us as we navigate through these issues. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Stephen Pei. Pei is an engineering professor at the University of Houston. He is former president of the Houston 80/20 Asian American Political Action Committee and the founding chair of the United Chinese Americans. And you can visit their website on www.ucausa.org. So today he will be talking to us about his volunteer and advocacy work around transparency, oversight, and accountability of government to ensure justice and fairness for Asian Americans, in particular, the recent investigations and prosecution of Chinese American scientists. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Pei.
Thank you, Sheila. 20 years ago, Dr. Wen-Ho Lee pleaded guilty to one count of improper handling computer files, and the government dropped the other 58 counts of charges. Dr. Lee is a nuclear physicist from Taiwan and a former employee of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. A federal grand jury indicted him on charges of stealing secrets about the US nuclear arsenal in December 1999. However, federal investigators were unable to prove these accusations. After being jailed, solitary confinement without bail for 278 days, Dr. Lee was released on September 13, 2000. In addition to announcing the verdict, George James Parker issued a statement apologizing to Dr. Lee for being led astray by the executive branch of our government. A story that has not been told to the public until recently is a visit led by a committee of 100 founder I.M. Pei to the New York Times editorial board. It led to an unprecedented internal review and the New York Times apology that its March 1999 report might have propelled an overzealous prosecution by the Justice Department. In 2006, Brian Sun and a team of Jones Day lawyers obtained a landmark $1.6 million settlement against the US government. More cases like this one happened repeatedly over the past 20 years. Are these isolated cases? Andy King is a Korean-American attorney. He conducted an analysis of over 100 cases involving almost 200 individual defendants between 1997 and 2015. He found the percentage of people of Chinese descent charged under the Economical Espionage Act has tripled since 2009. Furthermore, convicted defendants of Asian descent receive sentences over twice as severe as those of other ethnic groups. The most alarming finding is 22% of people of Asian descent charged with economic espionage were never convicted of espionage. In the past couple of years, National Institute of Health and the FBI launched a large-scale investigation of Chinese American scientists. FBI Director Christopher Wray testified at the Senate in February 2018. The China threat is a whole of society threat. They use non-traditional collectors, especially in the academic setting. Professors, scientists, students across every discipline. Therefore, it takes a whole of society response from the US. In August 2018, FBI held an unprecedented gathering at the Texas Medical Center in Houston. FBI won over 100 top leaders of Texas academic and medical institutions. The security threat from foreign adversaries. This was supposed to be the first step in an initiative to be replicated around the country. However, even before that, the Asian American community had been filled with rumors and fear. Half years later, in August 2018, Dr. Keping Xie, a former MD Anderson Cancer Center researcher, was arrested on allegations of possession of child pornography images. 3 months later, a grand jury declined to indict Dr. Xie, but the career of a top researcher was already ruined. The community was kept in the dark until April 2019, when Chronicle and Science magazine jointly published an exclusive report on the investigation and expel of Asian American senior researchers at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. Then we learned that in December 2017, the MD Anderson Cancer Center voluntarily turned over 10 years of emails of 23 employees to FBI. By April 2019, a number of senior MD Anderson Cancer Center researchers had already resigned or retired. However, no one at the Texas Medical Center in Houston was ever being charged for espionage. Most noticeable were Dr. Xifeng Wu, former chair of epidemiology department, and Dr. Minqi Hong, former vice president for basic research. After being put on administrative leave and cut off from her research team for over a year, Dr. Wu is now the dean of the School of Public Health and the vice president of the second affiliate hospital of Zhejiang University in China. Dr. Hong went back to Taiwan and is now the president of the China Medicine University. These were the top scientists that China and Taiwan had been trying to recruit for years, but unsuccessfully. Now the US government helped them to accomplish what they could not have done by themselves. In November 2018, Attorney General announced the China Initiative, which was designed to prevent and punish illegal technology transfer to China. According to one of the 5 US attorneys in charge of the China Initiative, all the Southern Talents Program does is induce people doing research in the United States to come to China and help them do the same research by offering them money. And that's not illegal per se. You can do that. However, Attorney General urged organizations to look out for individuals with divided loyalty, whether due to their participation in the Southern Talents Program or otherwise. FBI Director Christopher Wray said the Bureau has more than 2,000 active investigations that link back to the Chinese government. According to an attorney who has been retained by more than 24 scientists from universities and research facilities over the country, the government is investigating and criminalizing what amount to paperwork errors. In none of his cases, there is an allegation that an improper transfer of research or technology has occurred. These professors are all involved in fundamental research and publish their findings when completed. Failing to correctly fill out a conflict of interest form should not be deemed a federal offense. Last month, Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC and ALC, filed an amicus brief in support of Dr. Frankenthal to show opposition to the increased effort by the US government to profile and target Chinese American scientists. The brief was supported by 26 additional nonprofit organizations, including United Chinese Americans. The hearing of Dr. Tao's case starts on October 1st. This could be a paradigm case that I would encourage everyone to follow and show support. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you so much for that very informative talk, Dr. Pei. Many Americans are unaware of these rising attacks on the Chinese American academic community as a consequence of the anti-China foreign policy. So next, I would like to invite Hussein Karimi. Hussein is a graduate student in computer science at MIT, where he also completed his bachelor's degree. Karimi is active on campus in campaigns to fight racist discrimination and harassment. He will be talking about the growing anti-Chinese sentiment on university campuses. Please welcome Hussein.
Thank you, Sheila. I'm honored to be here today. My name is Hussein Karimi, and I'm a graduate student at MIT in the computer science department, where I also completed my bachelor's degree, as Sheila mentioned. I'm here today to speak about the surge in anti-Asian racism at institutions of higher education in the United States, a direct consequence of the increased aggression towards China. At MIT, international students make up nearly 42% of a graduate student community of 6,000. Of the international students, over 700 come from China, the most of any country other than the US, 300 from India, and nearly 200 from South Korea. And out of the approximately 1,500 postdoctoral researchers, 20% are from China, or around 300. International students at MIT and other research institutions teach undergraduates, conduct groundbreaking research, write grants, and are involved in other areas of work that are crucial to university operations. Moreover, they are our friends and colleagues and are a cornerstone of our community. Earlier this year, in July, the Trump administration announced a federal policy that placed harsh restrictions on international students, threatening over 1.1 million, over a third of whom are Chinese. Depending on their enrollment status with COVID, either all online or hybrid, those on student visas would not be issued visas for reentry or would be deported if they had no in-person coursework. After the attacks from the Trump administration on international students and scholars, the MIT administration responded by suing the federal government with Harvard to reverse the policy, which they did so successfully. This was not necessarily out of their own goodwill, but that they recognized how critical international students are to research, teaching, and funding. They also recognized the advancements China has made in manufacturing, artificial intelligence, clean energy, quantum science, and other areas of high-tech research, and that it is actually in their best interest to learn from China and not box them out. In fact, according to MIT's own data, over the past decade, the number of papers co-authored between MIT researchers and lead researchers in Chinese institutions of higher education have increased by tenfold. But despite all of this, the United States has exercised a politics of fear towards international students. There's a proven pattern with the United States. In the buildup to a new war, the US manufactures a campaign of racist fear-mongering against an entire people with the sole purpose of justifying and drumming up support for some aggressive act of war, in the worst case, military action that devastates a country. And as a son of immigrant parents from India and Pakistan with a very common Muslim name, it's actually something I've experienced directly at the height of the US invasion and occupation of Iraq that took the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, despite not even being from the country of interest. China is no different. In the case of graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, and visiting scientists, the Trump administration has falsely portrayed Asian international students as deceitful, as having ulterior motives. They call COVID-19 the China virus. The Trump administration has used rhetoric and enacted policies that do nothing but incite fear and scapegoat China for their own failures, most notably now over 200,000 COVID-related deaths in the United States. During the pandemic, by mid-June alone, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council and Chinese for Affirmative Action collected reports of over 2,100 anti-Asian hate crimes in the United States. Now for Asian international students, on top of the issues of visa precarity and re-entry, fear of retaliation because of visa status, and racist discrimination and harassment, they're threatened with outright exclusion from graduate school, postdoctoral research, and postgrad careers in the United States. In fact, my friends and I have spoken to Chinese international students at MIT who feel fearful of speaking up or expressing their political views because of the climate the Trump administration has created around China. These are just some examples of how the buildup to wars abroad have domestic consequences. The sections of the US government who are most aggressively beating the war drums against China are attempting to pull academic institutions into their camp, to demonize and isolate China and impose policies that discriminate against international students, particularly those of Asian origin. These policies are not only xenophobic and racist, but are a direct attack on the basic principles of academic freedom and actually inhibit breakthroughs in research. As graduate students, we refuse to be pawns of the US war drive against China. We say no to anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. But in order to adequately address this issue, we need to understand the root cause. That is a new Cold War against China. What we need is not more war and aggression, but collaboration and peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hussein. Next, I would like to introduce Satyavati. Satya is an immigrant from Southeast India and an anti-war activist based in New Mexico, where she is a leading organizer of the US peace and anti-war movement. She is also a recent nursing school graduate. Thank you for joining us, Satya.
We are witnessing the United States government and the Pentagon war hawks pivoting to Asia. But this is not the first pivot to Asia. The US government has waged a war on Asia for more than a century. In 1899, it waged a war on the Philippines to make the country a US colony. Over 1 million Filipinos died. then against Japan in World War II, when the US government callously dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians lost their lives. Survivors and their children continue to suffer with deformities and cancers generations later. Then in 1950, the US waged a war on Korea, split the country into two. Over 3 million Koreans, majority of whom were civilians, were killed. Then came the US invasion of Vietnam, which killed more than 4 million Vietnamese people and hundreds of thousands of Cambodians and Laotians. Now, the US government is once again making war preparations, this time against China, a country inhabited by over 1.4 billion people. The US is preparing for a so-called major power conflict, which of course is a pleasant way of saying World War III. The legacy of the United States in Asia and elsewhere in the world shows that nothing but death and destruction would result from this increasing US aggression and hostility towards China. Every time a government prepares for war, especially this government that we live under, it presents the enemy as being inhumane and barbaric. It uses heavy demonization and racist dehumanization of an entire people to make working class people in this country hate the enemy. This way, the US government can inflict unimaginable horrors without any major resistance at home. But the enemies of the US government are not the enemies of the American working class people. Poisonous nationalism is a social control mechanism that has been used by US politicians for too long to promote and justify endless wars. These same politicians also employ racist language and rhetoric to dehumanize the people of those countries they aim to invade and dominate politically and economically. The N word was used to describe Filipinos, the G word to describe Koreans and Vietnamese people, and the S word to describe Muslims and Arabs, all of whom have paid a heavy price. As a consequence of this ongoing war on Asia, people within the US who are of Asian ancestry are also demonized. Demonized and dehumanized, Asians in the US are also casualties of the war promotion and propaganda of the US government and its corporate media appendage. Asians and Asian Americans face racism and demonization as the US once again pivots towards Asia and the war drive heightens. We are othered easily by those in power because we are not white. In the United States, this anti-Asian racism conflates with white supremacy, the foundations upon which the entire American system fundamentally rests. Those who do not experience racism might not feel what people of Asian descent have felt at different times as they do now in this country: fear, marginalization, and isolation. Our call for peace is a call against racism. It is a call against war. But peace is not just the absence of war. Peace must mean justice. We not only want peace, we want justice. The pervasive anti-Chinese racism being pushed by the ruling class and the politicians of both parties must be stopped. Once the genie is unleashed, it is extremely difficult to put it back in the bottle. This dreadful racism will have devastating and destructive consequences for millions of people as another war is being brewed by the US government. This past Thursday, the House passed a resolution denouncing COVID-19 racism towards Asian Americans. Nothing but total hypocrisy and election time lip service. The politicians denounce racism at home while also promoting to the American working class the idea of a war against the Chinese people and their government using racism. In this period, when the US government is once again pivoting towards Asia, it is imperative that all people that are for peace and justice and against racism stand with the Asian community, especially the Chinese and Chinese American community. Working class people of all backgrounds should stand united, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native, and all others. We must unite against racism and war. We must unite for peace and justice. Thank you.
Thank you for that great talk, Satya. Last but not least, I would like to introduce Brian Becker. Brian is a longtime activist and is the National Director of the Answer Coalition, which stands for Acts Now to Stop War and End Racism. Please welcome Brian.
This has been an amazing panel discussion. If we think of racism as a multi-headed monster, we've been able to understand some of the different iterations of racism, how it impacts Chinese people and Asian Americans in different communities, in different settings, those on college campuses, those who are researchers, those who are doing business, people who are just going about their everyday life. If you're not Chinese, if you're not Asian American, you might not know, might not feel, might not realize the depth and the breadth of the racism that's been generated by this new war drive against China. You might not know, for instance, that Bay Area businesses, Chinese American businesses, have been targeted by arson, that those who dare have the Chinese flag visible have been vandalized. People might not know that there are FBI investigations against Chinese nationals now in all 50 states. People might not realize the level of discrimination and predatory attacks against Chinese scientists and researchers. This panel has been important because it's pulled together the different threads of the racism that's being imposed on the Chinese American and Asian American community. We have to think of this as a war not only against China or a war drive against China, but it is a drive against Chinese people. My organization, Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, was founded 3 days after September 11th attacks in 2001. We tried to make the point that we needed to resist the cynical use of the government trying to take advantage of the grief and rage from the September 11th attacks to channel that grief and rage into a campaign for new wars in the Middle East. Wars, it turns out, that were taking place against predominantly Muslim people. A campaign of victimization directed against Muslim Americans and South Asians and Arab Americans. All of that happened after the September 11th attack. The war drive against China, as we heard from our panelists, is also a drive, a racist campaign against Chinese people. We have to build a bridge of solidarity. We have to also understand the genesis of this campaign and also the genesis or the origin of the war against China. There's the old cliche that truth is the first casualty of war. In this case, in the approach of a new war, in the approach of a new major power conflict between the United States and China, the truth has been trampled in so many different areas. China is blamed for COVID-19. China is blamed for not telling the world about COVID-19. China is blamed by the Trump administration and by the president himself of perhaps having created the virus. China is blamed for the 50 to 60 million Americans who had to file unemployment insurance claims since March. China is blamed for the 200,000 plus Americans who died as a result of COVID, as a result of the utter incompetence and neglect and criminal failures of this government to protect its own citizens. China is a convenient scapegoat. And at the same time, the military-industrial complex, which one of the speakers mentioned, takes 60% of the discretionary budget of the national treasury each year. And the war spending is really about $1 trillion. That kind of spending can only be justified too if the United States has a sufficient enemy. Iraq is not big enough. Libya not big enough, Syria not big enough. The United States, in order to justify the looting of the national treasury by these war contractors, by those who profit off of death and destruction, it needs a pretext, it needs a rationale. And thus China provides what the military-industrial complex needs, a global enemy to take the place of the Soviet Union. So here you have animus and hatred directed against China and as a collateral damage against Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. One, as a pretext to justify the government's own failures. It needs a pretext to justify a war buildup, the ABCs of which are making vast sums of new profit for war contractors. The attack against China and the animus against China and the hostility thus against Chinese Americans and Asian Americans is a convenient tool by those who have power. And sadly, the corporate-owned media functions as an echo chamber, repeating these lies over and over and over again, such that American people have been told to believe them as if they are an article of faith. If you have a religious belief in something, you may not need facts. An article of faith is just that, faith alone. And we have in the United States the other big sort of part of the picture of racism, which is the economic underpinning of racist ideology, racist institutions, and racist culture. When you think about the rise or formation of white supremacy in the United States or in North America, how did it begin? It became as an ideological expression and an institutionalized practice by a group of very rich people who enslaved other people, enslaved, kidnapped African people, and could only justify the institution of slavery by creating and promoting and enforcing a system of white supremacy. That's why white supremacist ideas took root, and that's why they have been so enduring. Now we have in the White House a failed businessman, Donald Trump, who fancies himself the great negotiator, but who in fact is a failed businessman who over and over and over again crashed his own businesses, had to rely on big banks and government largesse to bail him out, literally from his own bankruptcy, is now telling the American people that TikTok and Huawei and WeChat are a great threat to national security, when in fact this failed businessman is really making the case for those American businesses that have been beaten out at the marketplace, the much vaunted marketplace, by Chinese technology companies. They brought to market a product that succeeded. And so the United States economic interests, the same banks and corporations, want to stop those companies. And so you have the Trump administration engaged in highfalutin modern day piracy when it comes to TikTok, when it has the kidnapping of Huawei's chief financial officer in coordination with the Canadian government. Beneath all of these attacks that are justified on the basis of national security and all of the attendant racist notions that go with them is really an economic interest of elites in America, and especially corporate and banking elites who don't want the Chinese companies and corporations that have created new products that are successful from being able to take part of their market share. It is in fact an economic war dressed up as a campaign to defend the American people from a Chinese adversary. And thus national security is used cynically to trick and fool the American people to be part of a campaign of hatred against China and Chinese American people. And the American people get nothing in return. The benefactors of this process are in fact the corporate and banking elites and the military industrial complex. Pivot to Peace exists because we demand that there be an actual discussion and an informed debate so that the American people can be disabused of the lies that they are being spoon-fed by the media and the government. We are carrying out a campaign from the grassroots. We think there's no project more important. Nothing is more important than stopping World War III, which is what major power conflict is a euphemism for. The road to peace, as we said in the title of this webinar, is not simply to oppose war, but to oppose injustice. The road to peace is to bridge solidarity, to reach and extend a hand to the Chinese American and Asian American community and tell that community and those peoples, you are not alone, that we stand with you, that as human beings, we are part of one human family. And this human family can either succeed and thrive together through cooperation and the rejection of the poison of racism, or it will be consumed in flames by a new major power conflagration. If you agree with our message, if you want to build this movement, if you want to show your support, as Judge Julie Tang said at the very outset, go to our website. It's peacepivot.org. peacepivot.org. Sign the mission statement. Say that you are for peace, not war with China. If you can help our movement grow, make a donation. It's tax deductible. This is the grassroots. We have no corporate backing. We have no big financiers. We are from the people, but of course we believe in the people. We believe, in fact, that there is no power greater than the power of the people. Once the people have learned, have been educated, have been mobilized, there is no power greater. That's our political perspective in a nutshell. That's our strategy, and that's our tactic. A grassroots movement of opposition demanding a pivot to peace, not a pivot to war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, for wrapping up our program today. I wanted to thank our diverse panel of speakers for joining our mission towards global cooperation and peace with China, and an end to racist attacks and violence. And if you haven't already, definitely please sign our mission statement at peacepivot.org/mission. Pivot to Peace's mission is to provide a space and platform for those throughout US society who are deeply concerned by the new US military and foreign policy doctrine. This is the doctrine that puts the country on course of major power conflict. We in Pivot to Peace believe that standing firmly against war and racism is the only road to peace. The current mainstream debate around US-China relations and the emerging consequences lack genuine, fair, and outright honest discussion. And as we've heard today, the history lessons of the past, along with real experiences of innocent lives, show us that we really have nothing to gain from further conflict with China. So please sign up with us at Pivot to Peace at peacepivot.org. And if you are able to donate, please consider doing so. You could do that on our website. Follow us on Twitter at peacepivot or on Instagram at Pivot to Peace. Thank you again for spending this time with us. And once again, we are so sorry for all of the technical difficulties that made it such that we had to end our originally scheduled live stream prematurely. But we will be posting all the videos and the speakers that you missed and the full webinar as soon as possible. So thank you again for your patience and flexibility. And yeah, have a great day and thank you for watching.